I think it's 7:30, and I want to welcome you all to what is our final of an amazing series this past year for the World Kamishibai Forum. And I'm very excited that our trip has taken us from Japan in the beginning and all the way to Australia, all around the world. So our panelists today are all such creative people I've been dying to meet, and I have sort of met virtually, but I would like to introduce them to everybody, as I have been doing. I'll just start here. So as I think any of you who saw Jackie's introduction in her video as well, she pointed out where she comes from in Australia. And although all three of our panelists today are well-traveled and world-traveled, they all are sort of centered on Melbourne, which is really interesting because that allows you to collaborate in so many ways, as you will hear. So first of all, I want to show where all three are from in Melbourne, the southern, southeastern part of Australia. Jackie Kerin is not only a wonderful Kamishibai storyteller and cartoonist. You have that cartoon series that you can see underneath your stage. But it seems like many of your Kamishibai have also transformed into picture books, or at least I know the amazing case of Dr. Ward has. So I'd love to hear more about that, nonfiction picture books. And Anna Manuel has been offering workshops to teachers and adults, parents through her organization Heads and Tails. So I hope that people will check out her website as well. And on the other end of the spectrum, from Anna, who works with very small children, we have Bernard, who has been developing Kamishibai for adults as well as children. And we just saw a graphic novel that he's been involved in creating. So we'll hear more about that later. And I just want to say that one of the things that, as I reviewed your videos, that comes across from all of your performances is just how spontaneous all three of you are, and developing stories sort of in relation to your audiences. So I just think that that's really fabulous and something that we need to see more of, because I think people are very nervous about performing often. They feel they have to perform exactly to the letter of the script. But as you show in your video so beautifully, you can create the stories as you go along for that moment, for that particular audience. So that's really wonderful. And I also want to tell everybody, even though this is the last in our series, we still have a finale, and we want to celebrate this year and have an opportunity to share all the things we've learned from each other. So please stay tuned for more details about that. We'll probably do that by Zoom so people can actually interact more closely with each other. So please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we will get started with our own questions. And as you're thinking of them, please put them in the chat so we can ask our presenters. So first of all, I just wanted to start by asking Jackie and Bernard, because you mentioned this in both of your videos, that storytellers in Australia start by mentioning the First Nations people and acknowledging them in the storytelling. And I think that's unique to what we've seen over the course of this year. So I'd love to hear where that started and how you bring that into your practice.
Oh, maybe both Bernard and I could talk about this. I did a bit of a search because I couldn't actually remember when we started doing this. I mean, any event you go to in Australia, whether it's the football, the opera, an event at your local library, there will be either an acknowledgement or a welcome to country. You can only do a welcome to country if you're a First Nations person of that place. If you are not a First Nations person with ancestral connections to the land, then it's an acknowledgement of whose country you're on. Now, when I looked this up, but I was thinking, we've been doing this for so long, I can't remember how it started, but it seems that it formally started in about 2010, when the federal parliament started doing an acknowledgement of country. Do you want to talk a bit more about that, Bernard?
One of the great things about these acknowledgements for various organizations and people, single artists, is that it makes you work out where you are in Australia and where you are. So if you've traveled, you go, oh, well, I'm on the land of the Gadigal people if I'm up in, up in Sydney. And so it's Australia is pretty a bit of a late comer to the white acknowledgement of Black history here, Aboriginal history here, Aboriginal building really of the country. And so I think the acknowledgement tradition is a way of inviting white fellas like us to be more conscious of the land that we're on and the traditions that we are imbibing somehow by being on the same piece of country. So yeah, so I say, for example, right now that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Bunwarang and Woiwarang people. Warang, it is an indigenous word meaning tongue. So tongue. So that's the tongues, the Bunwarang, and there are other Warang groups, and they form a nation, a big group who would come together for ceremony in what is now in the place that is now Melbourne. In fact, I think, Jackie, is this not true that they would actually come together, or maybe this is just a legend, but that they'll come together at a place that is now an enormous sporting ground in Melbourne. So the MCG, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, it's like a dreaming place for everybody. Everybody. People really love sport in Australia. I don't know why, but apparently it's very lovely. But people really still gather at this same spot, which is incredibly interesting.
And in Australia, the Aboriginal people have never ceded sovereignty, and there has never been a treaty. So we're really revving up for some truth telling and reconciliation that means something, that delivers action. So so what Bernard and I did when we do the acknowledgement is by no means a radical thing. This is what we do. This is what we do all around Australia. And good morning from Bunurong country.
And may I add, because I also, when I learned about this practice of acknowledging the country, and I moved to Thailand, and where there's no acknowledgement of country, it's not a practice there. I also brought an acknowledgement of where we are, of the land and the people who have told stories and created their lives and their families and their education on where we are currently doing a storytelling session or a workshop. And I've received feedback from parents and educators saying, wow, like we haven't really thought about that before. This is now the public library. That's all we know. It is. So thank you to this this form of acknowledgement of peoples and lives that built the land that we're wherever we are.
I think that's really, really fabulous because I think it's something we should all adopt, but also to really, like Anna says, think about where we are telling and the stories that come out of that. And I'm reminded of stories I've seen in Japan where people really use Kamishibai to tell their local legends and why children will see certain things in the neighborhood and go back to, you know, the origins of that. I did want to ask a little more about, I know that Anna is now in Melbourne, right? But you also live in Thailand. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you're bridging all of these places with your Kamishibai practice?
Right. So I learned about Kamishibai when I was in Thailand, actually, where I visited a Japanese preschool. And that was the first time I saw this wonderful storytelling format being told. And from then on, I looked more into it. And back then, like, I didn't have much resource. Like, there was one particular bookstore in Thailand, which is also a Japanese bookstore, and they sold bilingual and all Japanese Kamishibai, and the titles were quite limited. So I was, I guess, forced to create and learn how to make my own and for my particular audience. And so that's where, that was my seeding ground for learning about Kamishibai. And then I moved to Australia, and that's where I met Jackie. Well, I stalked her while I was in Thailand.
That's a great story too.
And yeah, in my first week of moving to Australia, of migrating to Australia, I saw Jackie in the Melbourne Museum, and I gave her a tap on the shoulder, and I told her, I've been following you.
Can I finish the story?
Oh yeah, okay, go.
It was Children's Book Week, and I was invited. It was in full costume. Bernard used to work in the museum as well, you know, understand the situation. Kids everywhere, Children's Book Week. And I'm supposed to be leading all these children through the museum and talking about this particular exhibit. And I get this little tap on the shoulder. It's the last thing I need, really. And she says, I'm Anna from Thailand. I just arrived in Australia. Can I talk to you? And I'm like, hold that thought. We'll do lunch. And yeah, so after I'd finished, we went and had lunch. And I just liked her straight away. What's not to like? And you know, Anna and I have been collaborating ever since, and we've had some fantastic adventures, including me going to Bangkok and working with Kamishibai with a bunch of teachers there. And then later on we went to the Federation of Asian Storytellers Conference in Bangalore, and collaborated on workshops there. She's so much fun.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, they make a marvelous team doing a Kamishibai workshop. I attend.
Thanks, Walter.
Yeah.
So did we lose Bernard? I'm not seeing him on the screen.
I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, so what I love about hearing your stories is that you all collaborate with each other, and even though you've all traveled in so many different places, you know, have shared stories and shared stages, and seem to just really have a community where you are. But we were wondering how pervasive it is in Australia, how much Kamishibai has moved beyond Melbourne, or when you've gone to these other places in Australia, are there other teachers or storytellers adopting the format?
We are the stronghold. We are the far as I know, Jackie.
Oh, look, Bernard and I had to look it up. We started, we were doing our thing and sharing resources, mainly the stage and stories when required. And then I looked it up. In February 2016, Bernard came over to my house and we started a Facebook group. That's all. We call ourselves the Australian Kamishibai Association. So that's all we are. We're a Facebook group, and we now have 4 admins. There's myself, Bernard, Anna, oh, no, there's more than 4. Danielle Bucher-Scott and Tetsita Watanabe. Yeah, and you know, Bernard and I just wanted to create a space where people might come together and connect and hopefully grow knowledge and resources and how-tos across Australia. I mean, we've got, I think, what did I look here? 123 members, mostly those are from overseas.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That sort of parallels what we found in the US as well, that we started the Kamishibai Connections Facebook group, and it has grown exponentially, but most of the people are outside the US. So we are trying to find ways to get more collaboration within our country. But again, when you're in such huge spaces, as you're dealing with Australia as well. And Bernard, you had talked about the work that you've done in other parts of Australia and in Japan with your mega Kamishibai. And I know that Donna in particular was interested in seeing if you had some pictures of what that might look like to share.
Yeah, Donna, I did look around my machine for pictures of the mega Kamishibai that I and a theatre group made in Minami Sanriku in Japan a few years ago, but I actually can't find any. But I will send you, Donna, a little comic book account that I made of that trip. And of course, as we know, comic books are a more realistic depiction of reality than photographs. I think we're all across that. So,
well, have you used that concept in Australia at all? The mega?
Never. No. But you know, it'd be really good. It'd be great to have a little caravan, the mega Kamishibai caravan that you travelled around various places, and the whole side of the caravan opened up. And it was like,
yes,
caravan Kamishibai.
Yeah, we can have, like,
that's
drive-in.
really cool.
We can have drive-in Kamishibai, Bernard.
But we can use like a food truck, you know, like how they open up.
Yeah.
And there's an awning, and then you can pull in. Let's talk more about that.
We're gonna have to feature that in our next World Kamishibai Forum. We'll hold you to it.
Fantastic. I was just thinking, it's interesting that we're talking about the Facebook groups and people coming in from overseas. Maybe commission and what I was finding out from our conversation, maybe it was whenever we were having a conversation, just how from the, you have this, I have a narrative about, oh yes, Kamishibai, it's so Japanese and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, really what Tara and you, Donna, were talking about, there's the Dutch magic lantern stirred in there. And maybe it's quintessentially international. Maybe it's the Esperanto of art form,
I love that.
It belongs to no one. It belongs to every, so maybe that's the, you try and tie it to nation states. It won't do it. It won't behave. It's this transgressive, border ignoring art form,
I was just thinking between the three of us, Bernard, when my brain's going clickety click, and I'm thinking between the three of us, we have taken Kamishibai. Well, you've taken it into remote Aboriginal communities, been up to
Cambodia?
Indonesia, Cambodia.
Yeah. Cambodia.
I've been and you've taken Kamishibai to Japan.
Sure. That's not possible. Is that possible? It's like Cole to Newcastle.
Mega Kamishibai.
And Anna with Thailand and Manila and
India.
And me with Singapore, India, a town up in Queensland, in one of the northern states, Rockhampton, me in museums, art galleries and botanic gardens around Victoria. Like we are, yeah. Oh, I was going to say we're viral, but we don't say that anymore. You don't say that.
I think that it is a really good point that Kamishibai has always been international, and some of the earliest the format that we use, not the puppets, but even the puppets, they did versions of silent films like Charlie Chaplin and you know, some of the Russian early talkies and things like that were some of the early Kamishibai. I think, in fact, the really first Kamishibai in 1929 or whenever it was actually performed was based on a Western film. So it is really interesting, that whole history and how things brought to, although in Japan they would say it's a uniquely Japanese form, which I think is true in the sense that there is this whole long history of etoki, of telling stories alongside pictures in a certain way. So that we have to acknowledge that as well. But I do think that you're developing a very Australian version of this format, and international version. And I'm interested to hear more about, each of you also work with other formats. So for instance, Bernard was just talking about comic books, and how do you approach comic books and Kamishibai differently? What do you think the differences are there?
Well, certainly, I mean, there, you know, when I try to talk about Kamishibai, I often say to people, oh, look, it's like live comic books, you know, just to kind of give a real pithy way in. While I'm saying that, I know in the back of my mind, I'm going, I know that these things are almost nothing alike. Like the idea that the fact that the performance factor, and that's us, is it Donna, is it Gaito?
Gaito.
Gaito. Us street Kamishibai people who, you know, really perform our shows. It's that's a big difference. Obviously, you know, if as a reader of a comic book, you're investing into the medium, but for me, mainly formally, is the fact that a comic book page has multiple panels on it. And so what the comic book page invites you to do is to transition from one panel to the next and to make those connections, you know, and that's the beauty, sublime beauty, really, of the comic book and the comic book page. With the Kamishibai, you know, I love making Kamishibai because you can just labor a whole lot more, or put a lot more. What you're focused on in the making of it is the creation of that single. It's a picture, as opposed to I think comics ask the eye to be moving in a reading way, and I think Kamishibai, the pictures, asked for the eye to sort of to enter, to play with in a different way to comics. So I'm very, very interested in this difference, and it's the again the narration, the live performance that creates the temporal. What are those axis of the narrative graph? Whereas in comics, you got this assembly factor that you're doing both as a maker and as a reader, an assembly action.
I just wanted to ask Bernard. I do not claim to be a great comic book artist, but this is what I did. There's a story behind how I came to do this as well. But when you're talking about the frames, this gutter isn't that called? Isn't there an expression, the blood in the gutter?
Yeah. So that's a guy called Scott McCloud, who's an American comic book theorist, great guy, and he says that we continually the reader continually invests themselves in the gutter.
In the gutter.
Yeah.
And now Kamishibai, we don't have a gutter.
No,
right.
But we do have that thing which you've all talked about in other, you know, across the forum, is that thing of the what next factor of Kamishibai. It's so, it's so in your loins, is like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? What's going to be on the next picture? I'm hanging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like what Bernard said about, like, to describe Kamishibai to, let's say, someone who doesn't have any background knowledge on Kamishibai. It's like live comics, because it paints a clear picture, like, okay, that's the most basic thing that you need to know as to this art form. And when I work with children and people working with children, how I say it is, it's like a theater, but you put that in a box. You shrink that into a box, and you put pictures inside this box. And then when you open the doors, it's a peekaboo type of storytelling, because I know they're coming from a picture book knowledge, because that's the usual question, like, Kamishibai, is it like picture book? And I would say, like, it's a peekaboo form of storytelling, because in picture books you see a lot of details. You see what do you call this, like the whole picture, right? But in Kamishibai, there's that peekaboo element that keeps you hanging. What's next? What's coming next? Tell me now. Yeah.
And if you can really draw like Bernard, I mean, you can the pictures on your cards can be alive and full of action. I mean, I can create pictures, but I struggle to make them the characters look really as though they're moving or shouting or so I've got to compensate for that,
Although I think it's always a challenge. I mean, some people say, why do you continue to be interested in Kamishibai? I think it's because it's easy on one level, but it's also an incredible challenge to do it well. So,
yes.
As you say, as you've done it, you've been improving. And I think we can all say that. But I'd love to hear more about how some of your stories, Jackie, have evolved into picture books, because I at least know the amazing case of Dr. Ward started as a Kamishibai, right?
Yeah. I've got a few passions that drive my creative energy, and one is the environment, doing the acknowledgement of country for over a decade now, really got me thinking about how we've changed the landscape with introduced plants, and that was something that I pursued. And we have a beautiful botanic garden, very small botanic garden near where I live. And of course, these were founded in the early colonial era. And when you walk around, you see plants from all over the world. So, I asked the question, how did the plants come to be here? And that led me to the story of the Wardian case. And a musician who I work with, and my friend Bernard Caleo, who is a programmer at the gardens and also a very keen artist, we worked on the story of the Wardian case as a Kamishibai. Had a lot of fun with that. Lorraine made over 20 cards for the story, and Sarah put music from the 19th century to the story as well. But but that story then only exists and reaches people when they come to see the performance, wherever that may be, quite often in botanic gardens. So I wanted more people to think about how the landscape had been changed with colonization. And so I came up with the book. So doing the book, of course, it's a whole different collaboration. Here I'm collaborating with Tal Sawanakat, an illustrator in Australia who was originally born in Thailand, educated in Singapore, and now lives and works in Australia. And so it's a completely different thing. I mean, it's an illustrated book. It's very different to Kamishibai. And once the illustrator and the writer have done their work, then the designer, in this case it was a woman called Kathy Larson, set to work doing the design and bringing all the elements together. So it's a completely different different process. But anyone who's listening to this who also writes texts for children's picture books, they will know there is also that same juggle that you do with Kamishibai, is that you don't tell, draw, say, you don't have to double up. You know, if you're drawing it, you're drawing it. If you're saying it, you're saying it. You can get into a kind of tautology. And with Sarah working with music, you know, we have to be careful that we don't say it with music, picture, and language. There's always a bit of an editing process that goes on there. So yeah, that to me is how it is. It's quite a separate thing and a different bunch of skills and a different kind of collaboration, but they overlap.
Can you give us some, can you think of some examples of some adjustments you had to make, moving it from Kamishibai format to picture book?
I just put on a completely different hat, Donna. I don't even think, oh, that was the Kamishibai, or that was, they're both very linear. It's very hard, although nothing's impossible, but if you're doing a Kamishibai, to do a flashback, so you tend to, the stories tend to be very linear. They begin and then they move through time fairly clearly. This is a 32-page picture book, and again, you know, it's very difficult to get too complex and do flashbacks and things like that, which you can do with a comic book, I think, but it's harder with a, you know, with a picture book. So again, it's very linear. Yeah.
Use more
Can't think what else to say.
detail in the drawings too, in the book.
Oh yes, yeah,
Compared
completely
to
different style. Yeah, these drawings are very very detailed, because you hold a book right, and look at the detail in that. That's Dr. Ward's house in London. Very group, because the watering cases led to terrariums, and he lived in like a giant terrarium in smog-filled London.
But I do think it's a wonderful exercise. I've done this with my students, to have a picture book and a Kamishibai story that try to tell the same story, and to look at how that's approached differently, because it does really help them understand the format better, I think. For instance, Momotaro, the Peach Boy, has been done in so many different formats. You can really bring all of those to bear and have the students themselves see the differences. So I think it's really effective. Yeah, and Anna, you actually seem to create your stories with your students as they interact, which I love that, because I find my students are my best critics. If I can tell a few times, they give me such great feedback. So I'd love to hear more about your experiences with your students' reactions.
Yeah. So I used to work with a group of toddlers, so 2 to 3, the most honest people you'll ever meet. And I take during that time, this was just last year. So during lockdown, I had and we had to interact on screen, right? And I had all the mental and energy and space to create Kamishibai, which are geared towards our lessons. So for example, it's just a balloon. The balloon story that I did as Kamishibai, it's all about nouns starting with the letter B. All right, so we're learning the letter B. And so I drew all these B pictures and practiced with them how it, I know, like how it starts, how it moves forward, how it ends. And so there would be some pictures. Okay, I drew a bagel, and I thought it was understandable as a bagel. And they all said, it's a donut. Like, oh no, the letter D. Oh. So I had to make some tweaks. I still have to make some tweaks on that. And also I was thinking like bagels. Children in Thailand, although I was working with mostly expat families, they don't eat bagels for breakfast. So I had to take into consideration giving, you know, like a cultural background on the stories that I'm telling, or if I really need to use a bagel to tell a group of, let's say, students coming from Asia, then I need to set the ground for that, you know, like a short introduction to what it is and what it would taste like. Right. So yeah, so I've done a few tweaks. I've done a few runs with them, and I asked them at the end of each lesson. Well, it was a lesson, but also a workshop for myself. What else starts with a letter B? Can you give letter, you know, can you think of things? Or another way of doing it is I would get a bag of random things. So things that start with B or things that start with other letters. And I would ask them to pick something up, pick one from the bag, and then identify, does this start with the letter B? What is it? And then I would see, oh, so they're actually drawn to a teddy bear, or they're drawn to a book. Yeah, why didn't I add a book in that Kamishibai? So doing all these different ways of drawing out information from children informed my Kamishibai, informed, you know, like how to make that particular story a lot better. Yeah.
It sounds like you could even do a different Kamishibai story with each group as they give you different ideas. Which reminds me, you know, of Bernard's story as well. I love the idea of bespoke or occasional Kamishibai. It's not something you hear about very often. And I think actually it's really interesting in the history of Kamishibai. The format that we use now is based on something. It's based on film, but also on something called ebanashi, or picture cards, that were used. And one form of ebanashi was to draw it as you told the story, which reminded me very much of what Bernard was talking about. But I'd love to hear more, Bernard. I think that takes a lot of courage, and you have to feel like you're up to the task. So I'm wondering, you know, how you go about doing a bespoke or occasional Kamishibai.
Look, yeah, it's more chutzpah, I think, than real actual courage. It's just, but it's also that thing of, you know, that the beauty of this form is, as I think I said, another point, you know, you point to a blob and you go, that's a car, my friends. And everybody goes, oh, right. That's what, you know, you're sort of you're both telling the story, but also you're giving the, like this is what Anna was saying 1 minute ago. You're giving the semantic system that works within that world. And actually, I'm reading a very interesting theorist at the moment, a guy called Kendall Walton, American writer, wrote a book in 1990 called Mimesis and Make-Believe. And his idea about fiction, all fiction, you know, film, books, comics, I would say, but it would totally make sense for Kamishibai, is that what fiction does is it provides us with props that we then use in games here of imaginative play. So the game of make-believe, which we play as children, and we go, here's a, oh, great, here's a shield. I'm going to use that. And so we all just sign on for, yeah, okay, this is not a book anymore, it's a shield. This guy reckons that that's what all fiction does. Now, of course, the beauty of the social form of Kamishibai is that I'm there, here's the box, here's the pictures, I tell you the rules. I tell you you know, this guy is the hero, even though Golden Bat or Gonbato looks like a crazy villain from, you know, he's got a skull for a head and blah, blah, blah. But if I let you know that he's the villain, then we have that in our, in the world, in the make-believe world of this little story. I can't even remember what I was saying now, but I think it was something about bespoke Kamishibai. And for me, I like working fast. So if someone says, let's do something tomorrow, I'm like, great. love it. Let's go. And I love the freedom of like, well, these pictures are going to be a little bit crappy, but that's okay because this form doesn't love crappy, but it certainly it has built in. You can make very beautiful kamishibai. You can make very simple kamishibai. Sometimes the simple one works better, or better, you know, is speaks more directly, or I don't want to say that. Actually.
I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things I love about what you're saying is that very often in American classrooms, I get teachers and students who say, I can't draw, you know, and they want to take pictures from somewhere else and use something realistic looking. And I keep telling them, you know, once you start drawing, even if it's stick figures, it's going to become your style, right? Especially over a series of images and the way you're expressing that movement. And as you say, if you tell somebody that's a ninja warrior, they're going to believe you as it moves through the story. So I think that's really important and kind of frees you up from feeling that everything has to be such perfection.
Yeah, and actually, you saying that about it just makes me think too about the Slovenians. I love the Slovenians. Kamishibai is crazy. I've got to get to Slovenia and Ljubljana. It's amazing what's happening there. But their stuff with sticking stuff on, like it's not 2D. Some of their stuff is 3D. That puppetry background, you know, and just you saying then, I think, Tara, I was just thinking about inviting kids to, you know, stick Lego figures onto cards and then draw around those just to give. And I think I'm maybe just following on from that idea of what we do with stories, all of us, in this way of thinking about it, is we're offering props to them for the other people. We're not an audience, they are participants. You know, and that's certainly what happens in a kamishibai setting. You know, kids yell stuff, you know, we're in it together. You know, it's live. And so if I can offer you a prop and you throw something back to me and then I can incorporate it in. I mean, I'll imagine, you know, saying there needs to be a throwing star and then just getting in there and drawing a throwing star on the card. That'd be wild, you know.
Right. Yeah. That's so interesting. When I first went to Japan to study kamishibai, and I was doing actually just storytelling, what's called subanashi without the cards. But the way I've learned to do storytelling is very interactive. And the response of the audience was, that's not storytelling, that's kamishibai. Wait a minute, I don't even have the cards. Yeah, because in Japan, storytelling is a format that is very somber, and you have a candle and you just tell the story in a very literary way. It comes out of the public library style of storytelling with a candle in a dark room, and you know, all of this very calm. And that's not the kind of storytelling I do. So, but I thought that was so interesting that just making it interactive made it into kamishibai.
Made it into kamishibai. That is fascinating. That is fascinating. That says something about the spirit of the thing. You know, the spirit of the thing. Spirit of kamishibai is this sort of you know, people throwing stuff around a room. Yeah, I love that.
I think we're all talking about something that I'm interested in, which is how we use language when we talk about storytelling. I often say to people, you know, no, we're telling stories with people, not to people. It's with people, and children particularly like to tell stories with you. And I mean, I've had some amazing experiences when people say to you, what is it? Why do you keep going with kamishibai? Well, you just, you know, I've got sequences of extraordinary experiences I've had, particularly with children who are marginalized from the mainstream for whatever reason, because they can't hear, they have trouble with audio linguistic processing, emotional trauma, physical trauma. you bring out a Kamishibai. I'll just tell you quickly one story. I had a little boy who never spoke, apparently. I don't know these things. I go into schools and I don't know these things. And it was a specialist school for kids that had been withdrawn from mainstream schools because of behavioural issues related to trauma. And he sat up the back. He wouldn't sit with the other kids. There's only about a dozen of them. And I'm telling the hare and the tortoise, a story which I exchanged with a colleague in the Netherlands. And suddenly he leans forward like this and he says, make the hare tell the tortoise. And I forget what he asked me to do. So I did. Then he says, make the tortoise now tell the hare. And he started, and the teachers are going, oh my God, you know, he started to tell the story with me. I was, yeah, I just thought, tick, the magic of Kamishibai.
No, and I think that, again, going back to Slovenia, we should all visit Slovenia.
Let's do.
But they're doing a lot of work as well in schools with children with various disabilities. And I've certainly found that in my practice as well. And you go into a school not knowing the situation and suddenly
Yes.
children are responding in ways that teachers don't expect. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all those things that you learn from children, from those audiences or groups that are more willing to participate and tell the stories with you, they sharpen you up. And then when you're working with adults, it all rolls in, it all feeds and strengthens your skills and your practice, I think.
Yeah, well, I want to make sure that before we run out of time, I know in the beginning, Bernard was showing us his graphic novel that and I know in the chat he put the information about how to order it. So maybe before we end, we can make sure that he can show us that again. Oh, yeah, that's right. Jackie has it.
Thank you, Jackie. You're so on the ball. So
Well,
yes, this is still alive.
I just think brilliant.
Yeah,
It needs to be known.
Yeah, great. So I'm also part of so I make comic books and I talk about comic books and I do comic book workshops. And one of those comic book hats is being a part of a graphic novel publisher. So me and a couple of mates here in Melbourne have said, oh gosh, there's no graphic novel publisher in Australia. There probably should be. That should probably be us. So we published the first one a few years ago, and this is our second that we've published. And it's by a man up in Sydney, up in New South Wales, who has visited the detention centre that we have, one of the detention centres that we have here in Australia that we hold asylum seekers. So asylum seekers come here by boat. They come down from Kamishibai, from Indonesia, and they are arrested and placed in jail, basically. And so this comic book is an investigative piece of journalism in comic book form. Our author, Safta, has gone into Villawood Detention Centre, spoken with the people, and actually conducted art classes there with the asylum seekers who were there, held there for years. And it's a very cruel and unusual way to treat, you know, the stranger. The great tradition, human tradition of hospitality, of the stranger, of the person requiring help, has been trodden on, has been betrayed by this policy. Anyway, this book is not only an account of various of the people of the asylum seekers' lives and their incredible travails in making it to Australia, only to be locked up, but also by the author Safta about his moral position on, well, can I be telling these stories? Is it my place? And the place of art making as a way of not healing trauma, but working with trauma, transforming trauma. So it's a multi-layer book, but I think its strong things are its communication of these stories, which are vital, and this reflection on the process of art making and how it helps us to be human, how it helps us to work with the difficult stuff of life, which is inevitable. So yeah, thanks. That's
Yeah, well, thank you so much for introducing us to that. And I think that's a really beautiful way, since we're running out of time, to wrap this up and say, you know, from Anna's wonderful interactions with 3-year-olds and developing Kamishibai stories, to Bernard working with adults and creating comics, but also adult bespoke Kamishibai for different occasions, that you really cross the spectrum of ages and interests. And one of the things that we are talking about, if we do a second incarnation of this forum, is to bring together people who work with different populations and different interest groups and different themes, not just by country, but say people working with people in disabled schools or senior centers, or there are just so many different venues where people are working with this format. So we will ask you back again, I'm sure, at that point. But thank you all so much. And again, stay tuned for the way that we will celebrate the end of this really wonderful series. I've had such a good time meeting people I wouldn't have had an opportunity to meet otherwise, because this Zoom and webinar format has allowed us really, even in the virtual space, to make close connections. So thank you very much.